a known felon comes into the gun store and says, "Hey, gun store, I want to buy a gun." And the gun store says, "Well, you're a felon, but I tell you what, here's a 4473. We'll just go take a coffee break while you go ahead and fill out this form that says that you're maybe not a felon, and we'll sell you the gun." That's a willful violation.
Yeah. We are the Armed Attorneys. Today, we're talking about an important new lawsuit that could have nationwide implications in restraining the ATF and trying to run gun stores out of business. But before we begin, show your support for the Second Amendment by hitting that like button. And we got to say thanks to our sponsor today, Sonoran Desert Institute. Check them out at sdi.edu/armed-attorneys for online gunsmithing, armor courses, and so much more. sdi.edu/armed-attorneys. Now we're talking about a new lawsuit, and it's been brewing for a little while, but we've had several requests to discuss it. And this has to do with the Gun Owners of America and Morehouse Industries suing the ATF in their zero tolerance policy on federal firearms license FFL revocation. So this is a big case because of, there's a lot of things. One, they're running good gun stores out of business, but this has the downstream effect of creating a gun registry, of limiting the hobby, of all these other things. And so I'd like to talk about it. So what's going on?
Well, so it's part of the anti-gunners game plan. They figure if they can't go after the guns directly, then they'll go after the way that people can acquire guns. They'll go after the way that people can pay for guns. They'll go after things that are accoutrement of guns, like the magazines and the ammunition. And so it's really, the anti-gun folks' plan is very transparent, and this is part of it. And so this is what Biden has done from the very beginning. He said, "Look, I can't get Congress to do this, and so I will use my power, the power of the administrative agencies," which is a very dangerous power. Unfortunately, it's been growing in America for almost 100 years now. But the administrative agency to basically weaponize the law, to use a term, to say, look, the federal government's in charge of who can lawfully engage in commerce of guns. We're going to start coming down on these people. And what they announced was this zero tolerance policy for willful violations of the gun law. Now, of course, whenever Biden speaks, he talks about, oh, these are the same FFLs that sell to cartels and peddle illegal guns.
You mean the ATF? Operation Fast and Furious.
The ATF has lost more guns than any gun dealer I've certainly ever heard of or read about. And so they think that there's all these nefarious people who go out, get FFL license just for the sole purpose of engaging in illegal activity, which is just simply not true. I mean, that's this myth that they've created. But they have now weaponized the word willful, and they're basically going after particularly troublesome FFLs like Morehouse, because Morehouse was instrumental in going after them for the frame and receiver regulation that they have attempted to pass. And they're going to have them, they directed the ATF to pull their license for basically 5 violations, 3 of which were clerical paperwork errors.
Yeah, and again, why is this so stinking important? Well, there's a couple of things. First, whenever and we've seen this, they're trying to funnel all firearms transactions through FFLs. Up until just about a year ago, the firearms transaction record, the 4473, FFLs only had to keep those for 20 years. Well, they changed that policy. Now they have to keep those records indefinitely. So now, all right, so we're funneling all the transactions through the gun stores. We have to keep these records indefinitely. And then we have a provision where if this FFL ceases doing business, they have to turn those records over to the ATF. So we see the ATF driving these folks out of business, taking those records, and they're creating a gun registry apart from just limiting the hobby and people's access to firearms. And it goes back, like you said, to that word willful. And when the Congress passed this regulation, willful meant like a deliberate act where somebody's going to make a misstatement on the firearms transaction record or some other kind of record. And they have changed the way that they're looking at the word willful and just saying any mistake.
Yeah, and which that's the thing about it is that originally you think of a willful violation, you think of a known felon comes into the gun store and says, "Hey, gun store, I want to buy a gun," and the gun store says, "Well, you're a felon, but I tell you what, here's a 4473. We'll just go take a coffee break well, you go ahead and fill out this form that says that you're maybe not a felon, and we'll sell you the gun. That's a willful violation,
Yeah.
not whether or not your employee who's been on the job for a month accidentally fills in one of the blanks wrong or misspells the name of the street that the person lives on, or something to that effect.
Or writes ST period, an abbreviated street instead of writing the word out street. I mean, that's how petty they're getting.
Oh, yes. And it's ridiculous. And they're claiming that these are now willful violations specifically for the purposes of limiting the options that citizens have available to them to actually acquire firearms. I mean, it's very nefarious. And with regard to the gun registry, several years ago, the ATF altered the Form 4473. This is one of the sneakiest things I think they've ever done, and I'm surprised it's not called out more often, is they intentionally altered the 4473 to have both the personal information of the firearm acquirer and the identification of the firearms on the same page.
Yeah.
They used to be on different pages, but they're now on the same page. And you think, why would they want them on the same page?
Yeah, I remember when that took place. I want to say that was in 2021. Personal information and firearm information used to be, I mean, you had to scan 3 pages of documents in order to have a complete record of the firearm transfer. And now the ATF only has to scan 1 page, and it makes their life a lot easier.
They're doing things like this, and it's just, it's going to be up to Congress to stop them. Here we have the courts that are going to try to do it, and of course, the plaintiffs have alleged numerous constitutional violations.
Yeah, let's talk about the causes of action. So the first cause of action, we've kind of touched on it a little bit, but essentially they're saying, hey, this reinterpretation of willful is arbitrary, capricious, and it's abuse of discretion, not in accordance with the law. So I mean, we've kind of talked about that one. Don't need to hammer that out, but I do think that that's probably one of their best arguments here. And another very good argument, this is their second cause of action, is that this violates the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, by interfering with the acquisition of firearms. What do you think about that?
Well, it's a very good one because obviously, we're all of us were not in the position to have the skill, the time, and the resources to make our own firearms, and so we depend upon firearms being safely manufactured by a manufacturer. We depend upon there being a retailer in order to provide us the opportunity to go acquire those firearms. So yeah, the Second Amendment not only includes the right to wear, bear, and carry, but the right to acquire the firearms as well. I mean,
Yeah.
what good is it to have a right to acquire when there are none available for you to acquire?
And we see there's some cases, and this isn't across the country yet, but we see movements, for example, on the purchase of handguns from federal firearms licensed dealers. Maybe that age changes from 21 to 18. We see these challenges being successful across the country, and that's something we got to monitor.
Also, one of the more ridiculous handgun regulations is the fact that people from different states cannot buy handguns from FFLs in other states.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's material to this particular issue because the two of the violations are that this is a Michigan company, I believe, and the allegation is that they sold a handgun to a resident of Georgia, even though the Georgia person was fully lawful to own and possess and to purchase the firearm. He was not a prohibited person. He was not a felon. He was not an unlawful drug user, but he was from Georgia. And that is one of the rules, is that FFLs cannot sell to persons of the other state. And in fact, that's sort of one of the original rules that allow the federal government to regulate this in the first place, because it's interstate commerce. And so Congress has the authority to regulate interstate commerce. Of course, this kind of tags along with the fact that one of their big pushes is to try to regulate intrastate commerce as well, which is what they always refer to as universal background checks.
Right.
That's their subterfuge. And so there's a lot of nonsense rules that are in place specifically to attempt to justify Congress's action in regulating interstate commerce.
The next causes of action, we'll kind of lump them together. The third cause of action is for kind of a Fifth Amendment violation for due process. They're kind of being retaliatory, vindictive. The fourth cause of action has to do with selective enforcement. And I'll say this has existed, I think, in the common law, and we've seen the selective prosecution argument made not too recently, but it's having some success in the federal courts. What comes to mind for me is border policy. The the Biden administration has said, "Hey, we are going to release women and children and prosecute men for, illegal entry." And we've seen those arguments made there, and the courts are receptive to that. So I think even though this is our fourth cause of action, I think that's actually a really good one as well.
Well, and it's good that it's now getting traction, because it used to be selective prosecution would get you nowhere at all, because the courts were only concerned with, look, did you do it or did you not do it? We're not, the fact that they didn't go after this other guy is not before us. The only thing that's before us is whether or not they went after you and whether or not you did or didn't do it. But due process is always a very interesting argument. Americans are entitled to due process. They're entitled to procedural due process, in many cases, substantive due process as well, in which this is the basis of enforcing a lot of our rights. Now, with regard to administrative actions, unfortunately, whenever the government has already been given the power to regulate something, it's very hard to get traction to fight these administrative actions, because it's never been held that you have a right to sell guns. So this right that you get is actually a right that's given to you by the government. As much as we may disagree with that philosophically, I don't think that your rights are subject to licensing. But the courts, unfortunately, have held that most of the things that I guess pretty much everything you do that requires a license, including driving a car, is considered to be a privilege and not a right. And so as long as we're dealing with a privilege, then the courts basically say that you have to comply with every single rule that the government attaches to the acceptance of this privilege.
Yeah. And our final cause of action that is listed in this lawsuit, we'll have it linked down in the description down below, is that this is a First Amendment violation and, redress of grievances to the government, and that they need access to the courts to try to correct this action. Maybe this is being made to just, tip off the court, hey, we need to have standing in this case, otherwise there's no other avenue for relief. I don't know that they would be granted full relief based on that cause of action alone, but I think that does show, I think, some good trial strategy.
Well, I think it also highlights the fact that this action taken against him is clearly retaliatory.
Yeah.
The government has been motivated to go after this particular FFL because of actions they have waged against the government in the past. And this is really this is an aspect of totalitarianism, where the government can single out people because they don't like what they have done in the past.
Thou doth protest too much, remove their federal firearms license. I don't like that.
No, it's terrible.
We hope you enjoyed this discussion. If you did, consider subscribing, hitting that like button, and help us fight the anti-2A algorithm by sharing this video. And as always, question and comment in the section down below. And until next time, we're the Armed Attorneys.
We probably got less than 10 minutes on that one, right? 14?